Hello out there, everyone. My name is Chris, also known as CV, and welcome to my channel. Well, in part one of this series, we covered the history of covenant agreements, tracing back to the Sumerians in ancient Mesopotamia within the Bronze Age, and widely adopted among neighboring cultures, including the Semites. We also briefly covered the origins of the word berit, B-E-R-I-T, the Hebrew equivalent to covenant. Keeping this in mind, let's now explore the types of covenants used in the ancient Near Eastern and Hebrew cultures, as well as their influence on the biblical patriarchs. Despite the concept of covenant having already existed in the Near East, the specific word covenant is not readily apparent in many Near Eastern texts. For example, the Akkadians use the expression risku u mamitu, meaning bond and oath, to denote a treaty. Moreover, because the Akkadians promoted the binding nature of treaties, the stipulations and a general format within the treaties are a precursor to the Hebrews' later approach to forming covenants. Now, along with the Akkadians, the Assyrians and the Hittites also incorporated legally binding treaties into their social practices. And keep in mind that this is all happening again within the Bronze Age initially. From that, two types of treaties became commonplace in the Near East, parity and vassal. In a parity treaty, kings from opposing cultures engaged in conflict or all-out war, or who had a history of divisiveness and instability, entered into a covenant agreement to create and sustain mutual peace and responsibilities, including accepting that neither would impose responsibilities on the other. For example, to end their war in Syria in 1290 BC, Hittite king Hattusil and Egyptian king Ramses II established a parity treaty. The second type of treaty, vassal, also known as a suzerain treaty, that's S-U-Z-E-R-A-I-N, suzerain treaty, was instituted when a reigning authority in one nation or region had power over other nations or regions, and the authority needed to ensure the subordinate societies would comply with the law of the land. In the terms outlined in the vassal treaty, and unlike the parity treaty, the authority slash overlord did not take on certain responsibilities. That's one key difference. However, the subordinate societies were promised peace and a friendly authority, as long as the subordinates slash vassals fulfilled the demands in the treaty. These two types of treaties shed some light on how they influence the covenants explained in the Torah, though scholars have debated whether there is a clear link between God's covenants with the Hebrews slash Israelites and how Near Eastern treaties were formed. For instance, when comparing components of the Hittite and Assyrian treaties to the Hebrew Israelite covenants, both have an introductory statement, a set of stipulations, and a deposit of the treaty. One key difference is that the Near Eastern treaties are polytheistic in nature. They mention gods, plural, as witnesses who can curse anyone who does not abide by the treaty. Whereas in the flagship covenants between God and the patriarchs, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, as described in the Torah, the single supreme God not only provides the covenant, he also gives signs of his power to reinforce the covenant. Furthermore, God is not described as only a witness, and curses are not detailed. Although there is not an exact one-to-one relationship between covenant structure in the Torah versus Near Eastern treaties, the similarities stand out nonetheless. In general, scholars accept that standard types of covenants existed throughout the Near East, and that the Hebrews then applied those standards as central to the relationship with their king, God. Consequently, the relationship between Israelites, and God far transcended the political dealings between humans. Now, as a quick sidebar here, if I'm fumbling a little bit on when I'm mentioning Hebrews and Israelites, my part one of this series, I did mention that I may have to interchange terms a little bit, so we know that the Hebrews or Jews were referred to as Hebrews prior to the Moses or covenant at Mount Sinai, and then referred to as Israelites after that covenant and once they had formed their home within Israel. And then eventually were known as Jews after the exile, Babylonian exile. So continuing on, and also as another sidebar, because covenants in ancient times were like how contracts were implemented, it is necessary to distinguish between the two. A covenant was considered a solid oath, and it did not require human witnesses, as the Near Eastern civilizations considered their gods the official witnesses. A contract, however, was not bound to an oath, yet it did require human witnesses. Overall, knowing the two main types of Near Eastern treaties, parity and vassal, as well as the similarities and differences to covenants in the Torah, gives a primer to the various ways berit is used in the Torah. Namely, whether berit signifies a friendship alliance between David and Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 3, a pledge between Jehoiada and his captains in 2 Kings chapter 11, verse 4, the terms of marriage explained in Malachi chapter 2, verses 14, a treaty between Jacob and Laban in Genesis 31, 44, or God's pledge to the Israelites to be a chosen people in Exodus chapter 19, verse 5, berit represents a variety of binding oaths. Still, this variety, and as it relates to the parity and vassal treaties of the Near East, can be further translated into two primary forms of covenant in the Torah, conditional and promissory, or generally unconditional as far as how it relates to a promissory type covenant. What may seem confusing here is that both types of covenants require some form of obligation, except that not all are exclusively one-way or two-way obligations. In Genesis chapter 17, verse 1, for example, God commands circumcision as a conditional one-way obligation that Abraham must keep with God. While in Exodus chapter 34, verse 10, God and the Hebrews have obligations to each other in the conditional covenant at Sinai. Conversely, a promissory covenant is generally unconditional, and it often involves gifts or blessings from God independent of obligatory conditional covenants, though it still requires vassal obedience. For instance, Abraham's faithfulness leads to a promissory covenant in which God blesses Abraham with land in Genesis chapter 22, verse 16. And on that note, and in part 3 of this series, we will talk more we'll use Abraham more as an example of discussing covenant and the covenants God established with Abraham. So be on the lookout for that next video coming up here soon. Hope you enjoyed this video here today. As always, please feel free to leave your feedback, leave comments. I highly encourage, a conversation about this. Also, feel free to email me at trcatholic@gmail.com, trcatholic@gmail.com. And also keep in mind throughout the series, as we're going through some of the more kind of technical nitty-gritty of covenants and getting some of the backstory and history, do keep in mind this is all going to lead to a big conclusion here of how covenant is still central to our faith today and why it's so important to be talking about it now. And again, how it could resolve so many issues among Christians in society, within a Christian belief, with sharing the gospel with the world and bringing more harmony between Christian denominations and with the Catholic Church. Until the next video, please stay safe out there, and God bless.